Okay, so this morning we start with two scholars, male scholars. The first one is Alejandro Pedregal, a lecturer at University of Wider Studies and visiting researcher at the Department of Film, Television and Scenography, both of Aalto University, institute where he worked as postdoctoral researcher and from which he obtained also his doctoral degree. Alejandro is a founding member of the Critical Cinema Lab and a film director and screenwriter of several award-winning fiction and documentary works. Besides multiple articles in journals and magazines, he has published the books Avelia, Testimonio de Guerrero, which came out in 2018, and Mientras los hombres conquistaban la luna y daban vueltas alrededor de la tierra, Rodolfo Walsh, El pastor de Girón, which came out 2 years ago, and as co-editor, along with Emilio Recanatini, he published La experiencia insobornable, Rodolfo Walsh en la memoria. Okay, please.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. I'm really happy I was invited to present this paper. And I actually changed a little bit the title of my paper. So originally it was and only the light should be seen. The shared origins of Latin American Testimonio and third cinema, and as the presentation has focused so much on Rodolfo Walsh, I decided to rename it Rodolfo Walsh and the shared origins of Latin American Testimonio and third cinema. So, Argentine writer, journalist, and militant Rodolfo Walsh wrote Operation Massacre, in 1957. A work of investigative journalism on the massacre of José León Suárez, carried out by the police of Buenos Aires. But at the time, Walsh did not intend to create a new literary genre, such as what later was labeled as Testimonio. On the contrary, during an intervention at the University of Buenos Aires in 1973, where he had been invited by Aníbal Ford, he claimed in a sarcastic manner that he just did it because he wanted to be famous, win the Pulitzer, get rich. Instead of that, while writing Operation Massacre, he had to get a fake ID and go underground to survive, as he was being persecuted by the coercive forces of the military regime. The institutionalization of Testimonio as a Latin American literary genre would take several years to come. In 1960, the Cuban institution Casa de las Americas, established soon after the revolution, started to give a series of awards in the areas of poetry, novel, short story, theater, and essay, which became increasingly prestigious with the pass of the years within the Latin American literary field. In 1970, coinciding with debates on what Cuban scholar Idalia Morejón Arnaiz has called the shift in subjectivity and the ideological role of the writer to transform popular consciousness, Casa de las Americas established the new literary award for testimonial literature in Latin America. In issue number 200 of the magazine Casa de las Americas in 1995, Cuban scholar Jorge Fornet collected part of the discussion that occurred on February 1969 in the institution, leading to the creation of this award. Until then, most of testimonial works competed within the awards for either novel or essay genres. Fornet exposed that certainly Casa did not create the genre, but by establishing the award, it legitimated it and provided a new reference framework for a genre with a very defined political connotation. In the discussion, which saw testimonial literature as a transgeneric form privileging the political function of giving testimony over its possibilities as a new genre, a series of relevant literary figures participated. Uruguayan writer and literary critic Ángel Rama, Chilean writer Isadora Aguirre, German author and poet Hans Magnus Enzensberger, Guatemalan playwright and writer Manuel Galich, Argentine literary critic and writer Noé Gitric, and the founder and director of Casa de las Americas, Aide Santamaria. During the encounter, Rama spoke out about the increasing importance of certain works that gave testimony about what is happening in Latin America and the Latin American struggle through literature. Enzensberger, who also talked about the exhaustion of literature's popular influence and called upon literature to give testimony and enlighten people's consciousness through its pedagogical value, asserted that the series of yarns in the words were obsolete, as they excluded the reportage, the testimony, the photography, and the non-fiction novel. Gitric even suggested that this solution could be deeper and more critical, and thus journalism or testimonial literature could even replace the current essay category, which he felt was in absolute crisis. And thus, in various ways, the discussion encapsulated questions of the indivisible cultural and political of the time, rethinking, to rephrase Walter Benjamin's famous expression, the literary forms appropriate to the energy of the times. On March 1970, a short text appeared in the monthly bulletin of Casa, written by Galich. In it, there was an attempt to define testimonial literature as a yarn, specifying what in the rules of the words of the word had been established as a book in which is documented from a direct source an aspect of the current Latin American reality. It then distinguished Testimonio from other yarns with which it could share certain elements, such as the reportage, the narrative, the research, essay, and the biography. One of the crucial aspects Galich underlined in his text was the value of local specificity in the testimonial literary work, being carried within the Latin American quandary, he wrote. A month before, in February 1970, Galich had already invited Rodolfo Walsh to be part of the jury of the New Word, praising the significance of Operation Massacre and arguing that, as he was the author of one of the works of the best quality, highly representative of that yarn, your orientation and advice would be very valuable. Both Walsh's literary and political profiles could not be more in harmony with the aims of the lead taken by Casa de las Americas. As part of the founding team of Prensa Latina in Cuba after the revolution, along with figures like its director Ricardo Massetti, or writers such as Gabriel García Márquez and Juan Carlos Onetti, among many others, he had been key for discovering the plans for the Peaks Bay invasion. And after Che Guevara's death, which, as he expressed in his participation at the Cultural Congress in Havana in 1968, it meant for him a new point of departure, he was profoundly immersed in the revolutionary political activities in Argentina, which would take him from the Revolutionary Union, CGTA, to the guerrillas FAP, FAP, and Montoneros, a militancy that could ultimately lead to his murder and disappearance. Thus, at the end of April 1970, Walsh replied to Galich's request, and I quote, "I believe it is a very wise decision from Casa de las Americas to incorporate the testimonial yarn in the annual contest. It is the first legitimation of a medium of great efficiency for political communication." End quote. By the institutionalization of the testimonial yarn within the Casa de las Americas Awards, Walsh had already written 3 testimonial novels. 2 had been published as such, Operation Massacre and Who Killed Rosendo, while the third one, the Satanowski case, had appeared through a series of investigative journalist notes, mostly in the magazine Mayoría, and would be collected later as a book in 1973. Therefore, as Claudia Hillman has exposed in her seminal book on the literary scene of the era and its connections to revolutionary politics, Entre la pluma y el fusil, between the pen and the rifle, and I quote, the testimonial novel would come to replace the exhaustion of the novel as a tool for knowledge. In Testimonio, the knowledge of reality came first, to which the author witnessed stamped a fundamentally historical meaning. In this regard, Testimonio could emerge, in the words of Argentine cultural theorist Gonzalo Moisés Aguilar, as a genuine Latin American literary form different from non-fiction, taking this level in the fashion associated to the school of the American New Journalism. And this could be so because while the later relates to fiction through a negative term, suggesting that fiction would be the primal source of literature, Latin American testimonial literature emphasized the use of positive label. Thus, this did not imply a break with fiction, but a dialectical reformulation and transformation of narrative forms for other purposes. Among them, and far from any pretended neutral, objective, or equidistant claims, its undisguised political commitment and its aims for social justice. The same year of that meeting held in Casa de las Americas, 1969, the Tricontinental magazine, established after the first Tricontinental Conference and the formation of OSPAL, the Organization of Solidarity of the People of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, had published a text that would become a milestone for the radical film scene, towards a third cinema by Argentine directors Fernando Solanas and Octavio Getino. The text was written as a reflection on the outcomes of the work and distribution of their film, The Hour of the Furnaces, which had been released clandestinely a year before and mostly shown thanks to the involvement of active political actors connected to the unions and other revolutionary organizations in Argentina under the dictatorship led by Juan Carlos Onganía. As part of this scene, Walsh himself had participated in the distribution of the film. Paradoxically, as obsessed as he was at the time on the assumptions himself had made all his life on the novel as a superior form of art, because, as he wrote in his personal notes, the norms of art I have accepted are bourgeois, but yet he claimed he had the capacity to pass to a revolutionary art, Walsh saw in The Hour of the Furnaces a path to follow, a path I started to travel 10 years ago, he said, referring to Operation Massacre. Solanas and Getino's towards a third cinema, whose expanded version appeared later in Mexico, first in the magazine Cine Club in 1970, and later collected in Alberto Ijar Serrano's book Towards a Third Cinema in 1972, and could be broadly translated, appear in a context where there had already been a great theoretical elaboration within the film field of the region, forming what had been labeled as the new Latin American cinema. Filmmakers such as Fernando Birri, Glauber Rocha, or Julio García Espinosa, and other leading figures that had contributed to transform both fiction, like Tomás Gutiérrez Alea, who would later elaborate the seminal book The Viewer's Dialectics, and documentary, like Santiago Álvarez, had engaged for years in debates on the role of formal experimentation and the limits of legibility in cinema in times of revolutionary emergency. These debates had been joined by prominent figures like Chris Marker, Joris Evans, or Jean-Luc Godard, just to name a few, and could be later spread thanks to the international encounters organized by the Third World Cinema Committee in Algiers, Buenos Aires, and Montreal. It is noteworthy that the origins of both Third Cinema and, by extension, the new Latin American cinema wave and Testimonio share a series of seminal ingredients in regard of their cultural, political, and intellectual legitimation. Thus, in the literary field, and using a model that engages explicitly with Pierre Bourdieu and implicitly with Antonio Gramsci by considering the intellectual field as the realm where the public debates get contested and shaped, Claudia Hillman has reflected on the modernization of media in Latin America after the 50s as one of the key elements that served writers to enter the political field, in the intellectual field during the literary boom era. And in this regard, Hillman marks two major events, both taking place in 1967, as defining moments for the literary ruptures and polemics that later took place. The publication of 100 Years of Solitude by García Márquez in May, which exhausted the boom novel form, and the killing of Che Guevara in October. For Hillman, the combination of both elements opened a series of debates in relation to the subordination of the arts to politics in revolutionary times, with a strong influence of what she calls an anti-intellectualist position. Consequently, this paved the emergence of Testimonio, among other genres, in search of what Cuban poet Roberto Fernández Retamar called a new realism, a debate on realism and modernity that might echo a more famous one kept in the 30s between Lukács and Brecht and Benjamin, a link perhaps better expressed intuitively, intuitively by Walsh himself when, in an attempt to reconcile arts and politics, he said that realism doesn't oppose necessarily avant-gardism. When the exhaustion of themes or forms weakens the picture of reality and its interpretation, the realist author becomes avant-gardist inevitably. Avant-garde is then the way that realism assumes in a historical conjunction of exhaustion. In Latin America, the realist writer is in the avant-garde when he makes clear whatever is invisible. Well, and he actually names Carlos Fuentes and Cortázar as both realist and avant-garde without contradiction between the terms. Following Hillman's model, we could claim that both aspects, the exhaustion of forms and the impact of the killing of Che, conditioned the emergence of third cinema too, even if expressed in a different manner due to the specificities of each medium. As for the impact of Che's death, let's recall that it appears central to The Hour of the Furnaces from its very title, as the title referred to José Martí's verses, "Is the hour of the furnaces, and only the lights should be seen," which were opening Che's message to the Tricontinental in May 1967, that appeared in issue 2 just a few months before he was killed. Additionally, and at the end of the film, a long frozen frame of Che's death portrait with eyes open seemed to face the audience in a call to honor him through decisive action against the social injustice he had fought against. Otherwise, and similarly to the inquiries of the literary field in regard of the exhaustion of obsolete forms, the very notion of third cinema, formulated in confrontation to first and second cinemas, seemed to appear as a reaction against what for Solanas and Getino were outdated film forms, to which they referred as, and I quote, hermetic structures that are born and die on screen. And I end quote. And in a similar way, other labels associated to the new Latin American cinema, such as Glauber Rocha's Aesthetics of Hunger or Julio García Espinosa's Imperfect Cinema, seem to similarly see in those conformist forms, coming both from Hollywoodesque and auteur approaches, a representation of anti-emancipatory politics and bourgeois expression. When one looks back at these shared origins, developments, and significance of both Testimonio and third cinema, the importance of Cuba in these matters appears seminal. The revolutionary cultural policies of the island were key for the promotion of every major debate and polemic in the Latin American and third worldist cultural fields, due to the creation and support that the revolution made of institutions, publications, and events that helped to establish these very discussions. Thus, in literature, this role was centered around Casa de las Americas, which became the literary meeting point in Latin America and part of the Third World, defining by association or rejection the debates of the time. Their words and international encounters played then an important role, with the magazine Casa de las Americas becoming a significant medium for promoting polemics broadly, for instance, on the role of the writer and the intellectual in society and its commitment to revolutionary change. In the film scene, a similar function was played by the Cuban Film Institute, ICAIC, which could get involved in the production of major film works of the time, including The Hour of the Furnaces or The Battle of Chile. And for cinema, the magazine Cine Cubano would perform a similar role as the one played by the magazine Casa de las Americas for literature. To a different degree, Tricontinental magazine would be also part of this policy, promoting all sorts of anti-imperialist art expressions worldwide, with radical cinemas occupying a really important space in it. Its internationalist view, for which the magazine was translated to several languages, certainly helped this purpose. Therefore, in their search for a new realism, responsive to the urgency of their era and their aim for reconciling and problematizing art and politics, Testimonio and Third Cinema emerged marked by two factors that challenged both established inquiries on formal experimentation and the revolutionary potential of the arts. This was consistent in Latin America as well as in many other parts of the Third World, with a time whose objective and subjective conditions were largely defined by revolutionary politics. As we have seen, these politics reached a peak with the killing of Che Guevara, whose death meant a breakage in the intellectual and artistic realms that triggered the harsh criticism of certain forms which appeared obstructing the then perceived as imminent revolution and radical purposes for which these practices were working on. Throughout this whole process, Cuba provided a significant and rich institutional context that promoted, legitimated, and challenged the revolutionary possibilities of the arts and culture, ultimately transforming the literary and film scenes in the region and the Third World. This influenced a critical approach to theory and praxis, later embraced by authors as varied as Terson Gabriel, Paul Wildman, Michael Channon, Robert Stam, or Mike Wayne in the film field, or John Beverly and Frederick Jameson in the literary film, just to name a few, and it keeps echoing today. One could see this as a case of critical artistic praxis and inspiration that, by traveling from the global south to the global north, eventually inverted the hegemonic ways by which other artistic expressions exercised their influence. Extensive current radical artistic experiences in film as well as in literature and other arts prove that, despite the differences marked by each era and its specificities, exploring today these shared genealogies remain broadly inspirational for those seeking alternative paths for rethinking a critical culture of resistance and social change. Thanks.
Thank you, Alejandro. It was a very rich paper, and I really appreciate the way in which you showed also the transition from one medium, literature, to film, and how the concepts can shift. Before we open it to the floor, I wanted to ask you a very brief question about the legacy of the workers' correspondent movement. The early 20s movement. I mean, it seems to resonate with some of the ideas. And you mentioned someone in a quote. Someone talked about factography, which is, of course, very much related trend. So I wanted to ask you to expand on this Soviet precedent.
Yeah, well, I think it's I have written actually some other text about the influence of, especially the notion of operating writer in Tretiakov as used by Benjamin in the case of Rodolfo Walsh himself, in terms of how it's he engages with an approach to the role of writer and also a vision on the press, which strongly resonates those aspects. But then in the scene, in the literary and film scene, it is I think it's quite obvious when one thinks about the films and the approach to filmmaking and the approach to literature of the time, that many of those debates in the 30s, in the 20s and 30s in Soviet Union and Central Europe are connected to this, especially in terms of how to think forms, the limits of experimentation in terms of this approach to the politics of arts, right? And it is somehow an expression on the tension between these two avant-gardes, right? The one that is more like the political avant-garde, the revolutionary avant-garde, and the cultural avant-garde, which finds this tension in there. But I mean, this was quite, this was a quite controversial turn for many of them too. I mean, many of them broke with Cuba, especially this after 71 because of the Caso Padilla, and it's an interesting case to explore also the division that took place between the writers, especially.
Thank you. Other questions? Well, as we did yesterday, maybe we can gather the questions and then answer them. It's
battery problem. Okay, wait. We have to wait a minute.
We can shout also. Yeah. Then we can shout a lot.
Since, I'm sorry, I don't know the name, Jacopo brought up the worker photography movement, or worker correspondence movement. I would like to say that it goes beyond Benjamin and Tretiakov, and really had a European-wide impact that included the Worker Illustrated magazine, the Worker Photographer magazine, as it was. There was an association of worker photographers who were trained to provide photographs for the AIZ. It was also based in Berlin, run by Munzenberg as tactically independent of the Communist Party, although it was affiliated with Comintern. And in a way, it's Munzenberg who influences back to the Soviet Union and the use of photo essay and reportage, which is something Benjamin picks up on. And Tretiakov picks it up from Benjamin, and so the story goes. And then you have the Radical Photo League in New York that's linked to that, so it has a much wider impact. And then in terms of France, you have also the worker photography, the APO, and which links into the Association of Revolutionary Writers and Artists, which has its manifestation again in the post-war period in Eastern Europe. So I think what is interesting in your talk, and I think what I'm trying to get at, is the echoes, the reverberations are much broader than you might have imagined. Where Berlin is like, or Germany is like Cuba in the 30s and 20s. It's sort of the second capital that potentially can bring about revolution outside of Moscow. And also you have not only photography but also film, because Munzenberg will also start the Maison in Moscow and film in relation in parallel to photography. And I think it's interesting, like you say, reportage becomes sort of the generator of a new literature as well as a new cinema in the 20s and 30s, is what you're saying at this time. And then you have this magazine, Tricontinental, that becomes sort of the mechanism for the circulation of the polemics and the debates. And I think that's more parallel to the work of Photography magazine, where you find more the debates about photography and film happening rather than the AIZ, but then that's another story. But so I think it's interesting, these reverberations as they get picked up maybe through Benjamin. I mean, Benjamin saw Hartfield's montages and was also inspired by him and his thinking through of his ideas of uses of photography, montage, reportage in terms of literature as well. So I think what I'm saying here is more of a commentary, because for me what's interesting is what happens to this history in the 30s, when it comes back in the 60s, how it gets eclipsed, how it gets watered down. But in a way, what your talk makes clear to me, so thank you very much for your talk, is that it has a second life in Latin America more than it has maybe in Europe, in a more impactful way.
Thanks.
So thank you for your talk. Actually, could you go back to the quotation by Walsh about this one? I find extremely interesting, and I would like you to expand more on this debate between realism and avant-garde, because this was at that time a debate around the world, but specifically in Spain, there were a group of artists and art critics that they were trying to somehow introduce realism as a form of avant-garde, and through the works of Chronica, works that actually were reused in photography, and they were related to Renault family, by family anyway. But I mean, what I find very interesting is, there is a whole debate in a critical communism about the expansion of realism and how you could introduce another way of understanding realism as a form of avant-garde. But I think it's interesting because here it is avant-garde because the exhaustions of themes and forms weakens the picture of reality and its interpretation, so it becomes avant-garde. So I mean, I think in the visual arts, it's more like taking back, working on, it's not the exhaustions of forms, it's more reworking the form in a dialectical way that makes figurative artwork an avant-garde too. And so I was wondering how, if you could expand more on this, and also see how we can see it in cinema. I think it's through montage a lot. I think it's very connected because in the case of painting, it's through the idea of montage and juxtaposition that we can, this is what Joren says, no? That we can have an avant-garde that is realism at the same time. Okay, thank you.
Yes, and I would say also that in the 60s and 70s, the Soviet heritage of avant-garde was rediscovered in Cahiers du Cinéma and the Digavertov group with Godard and Solanas. Once we had a discussion with Fernando Solanas, and he said that he was very, very inspired in the code and the montage. But he said also in an interview, and it's interesting, in Cahiers du Cinéma in '68, when the Laura de los Hornos was screened, and he said, but the difference is that Digavertov and Eisenstein has the state, the Soviet state behind them, at least at the beginning, but the Latin American cinematographer has the army and the police. And there was also a third cinema in Uruguay or in Colombia, even it's not as developed as Solanas. But interesting that the context is different, even if there was a support of Cuba. In a lot of countries, it was not promoted by the state. I mean, in Colombia with Carlos Alvarez, and also in in Uruguay, and so it's interesting, this dialectic.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting because what you said about realism, Mario Handler from Uruguay, he said, I was very inspired by Aragon about this idea of realism, but it was not a kind of socialist realism, it was another kind of realism. And I think it's very interesting, this idea, even if the cinema, because there's this idea of realism with Bazin, etc., and it's interesting, this avant-garde appropriation of realism by Walsh.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you very much for all this perspective.
Thanks.
Alejandro.
Yes. So as for the first comment, yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I'm referring only to Tretiakov in relation to Walsh, not in the general scene. So of course it's a lot richer and broader than that. So as for as for expanding this or thinking a little bit about this, in terms in regard of the sentence, I think that when Walsh is talking about this is because they are debating a lot about, especially about the novel form, about the exhaustion of the novel, and what could be an approach to writing and to in literature that could kind of expand that could engage with the revolutionary politics that they want to, so they want to engage with, and there is all this debate also about the detective novel and the noir novel and all this type of stuff. So he's referring a lot to, or he's at that time, if you find there is this book that is collecting his personal notes called Ese Hombre y Los Papeles Personales de Walsh or something like that, and in there you see it's kind of his diaries, his notes that he's taking here and there, and so it's a very fragmentary kind of writing, but you find a huge struggle. I didn't mention here, but huge struggle about his relation to the novel, because one thing I didn't mention is that at one point they are kind of expecting Walsh to become the big Argentine boom writer, and they're paying him Jorge Alvarez, who's his editor. He's paying him a salary for to write a novel, and that happens right at the same time as Che Guevara dies, and then he meets with Ongaro, who's the leader of the CGTA, and then through Perón, actually, in Madrid. And he starts to engage with CGTA, which is this revolutionary union, and starts to publish a weekly paper in a very Leninist way, So it's kind of collecting news from factories and so on, and they are just kind of giving him some shape, and it's a really interesting project. And because of that, he's not writing the novel, and he starts to have more and more problems. That's why when he starts to do the research for who killed Rosendo, for Quien mató a Rosendo, and he ends up publishing that as a book, and he never finishes the novel. So it is about this time that there is this kind of internal struggle with why he sees the novel as this superior literary form, and then at the same time he realizes that that's something he has kind of assumed from a bourgeois education or the bourgeois hegemony on culture. As for cinema, the problem is same as in the literary scene, is a lot richer than that, because it's not only the montage. The approach to there is a same as in literature. There is a shift in the protagonist, in the protagonist of the stories, or who is the political agent of change and so on. But the new Latin American cinema is a very rich scene. I mean, there are approaches to film that are like The Hour of the Furnaces, that are very much connected to montage and are kind of very, very engaged to the approach to documentary by Santiago Alvarez and so on. But then there are many other films that are narrative films. What? Alea, for instance, and Alea has this wonderful text called The Viewer's Dialectics, or it was translated as The Viewer's Dialectics. It's actually Dialéctica del Espectador, in which he reflects. It's a late text. It's from 1979, 1980, I think, and he reflects about kind of the transition that cinema goes from the first impact of the revolution, and later when the revolution has to establish its institutions and has to, so going from the kind of the storm to the kind of normality of the revolution, and how the difference between documentary at the beginning of the revolution and why fiction becomes what's the relevance of fiction after that. So it's but of course Alea is talking about the position, in which he's talking in a country where the revolution has succeeded, and he's talking in a country where he is supported by the state. So it is a totally different case to Glauber Rocha or to Cine Liberación, or so. It's yeah.
Alejandro, it's very interesting, but I think we need to move on to the second talk.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Miguel, okay. Miguel Errazu is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Institute of Aesthetic Research in Mexico City, where he completed his BA in Fine Arts and an MA and PhD in Film Studies at the Complutense University of Madrid. His current research project, Room for Play, From Militant Cinema to Social Practice in Contemporary Art, explores Mexican militant film collectives and visual art groups of the 70s. He is a co-founder and part of the editorial team of La Región Central, Revista de Estudios de Cine, Film and Visual Culture Journal at Mexico City, at the Aesthetic Research Institute in Mexico City. He writes regularly about cinema, art and politics for several magazines and academic journals. Thank you, Miguel.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to share my work with you. And well, that journal is not going to happen actually. So well, it have to be said. I apologize for the length of my title. I am working on it. It should be shorter. Well, I'm a little long, so I will just start. What I'm presenting here is part of my postdoctoral research project, and broadly my research examines the reception and discussion of third cinemas in Mexico as a part of a complex system, even if overlooked, of connections, contaminations and discrepancies within the sites of production of Mexican politically engaged art of the 1970s. Thus, I look at the sites where third cinema could have played a determining role in the art field. That is not just the spatial and material circuits of production, distribution and exhibition of cinema, but also other permeable spaces more prone to transdisciplinary contaminations, such as roundtables, workshops, publication, exhibitions, screenings, seminars, conferences, academic expeditions, festivals, and so on. For this reason, a significant part of my work draws on the work of Alberto Híjar, born in 1935 and still alive. And Híjar is still a prominent Mexican Marxist theorist, political activist, and philosopher. And from the early 1960s onwards, but especially during the 1970s, he was instrumental in setting up the contours of a politically engaged cultural practice in Mexico that developed a wide range of activities of transnational solidarity. But Híjar was also a fundamental figure in the spreading of the theory and practice of third cinema in Mexico, as Alejandro have shown us. A theory that, to a significant extent, he himself introduced and reformulated throughout the 1970s. So the materials I'll be presenting are but a small note in this mapping of transdisciplinary relations between art and cinema, and as they serve for establishing networks of solidarity. They consist in material traces that led to a cultural project designed by Alberto Híjar for Nicaragua in the late 1979, a few months after the victory of the FSLN. This project was one of the first activities carried out in representation of the Mexican Front of Cultural Workers, a coalition of cultural groups he promoted in 1978, and consisted in a series of seminars, courses, and specific field practices that was entitled For Our Revolutionary Cultural Politics, as you can see. So, ¿cómo va esto?
Aquí.
¿Sí? No.
Se apagó, parece congelado.
A ver.
Ah, sí.
Well, this is, I'll go back to this in a minute, but this is the project. A brief presentation of Alberto Híjar, for those who don't know this figure. He, in 1959, and after studying chemistry and philosophy at UNAM, Híjar joined the newly formed Seminar of Aesthetics of the Spanish exiled Marxist philosopher Adolfo Sánchez Vázquez, and shortly after he created the live course on art in 1961. That was a kind of heterodox art history seminar aimed at stimulating multidisciplinary approaches to the arts from Marxist and anti-colonial positions. In these formative years, Híjar also got in touch with the work and the person of David Alfaro Siqueiros, that he considered the best example of a long-standing tradition of Mexican popular and revolutionary art. And indeed, he became really close to Siqueiros. I will go back to this in a minute. During the student movement of 1968, Híjar took part in the brigades and fight committees, and soon after, being a young and well-known scholar, won a position as lecturer of aesthetics in the Faculty of Philosophy. From that time on, he developed a feverish activity at the university. With his live course on art, he organized a series of activities abroad, mainly summer courses and conferences in different countries of Latin America. And I will show just the materials of something he did in Ecuador in 1969. And this is the official leaflet for his course, and then those are his interests in Ecuador. He also went to Cuba in 1970s, to Peru in 1970, Guatemala, Chile, and also he took his live course on art to Europe and the USA. Even if his courses dealt with problems of Mexican traditional visual culture, those journeys helped him establish a robust network of colleagues in different countries that led him to embrace a more openly political activism. In fact, Híjar joined the Fuerzas de Liberación Nacional, the FLN, the Forces for National Liberation, in 1973. That was a political military organization based in Monterrey, in Mexico, that preceded, it was the president of the Ejército Zapatista de Liberación Nacional, the ACLN. In February 1974, he was illegally captured, imprisoned, and tortured by the Mexican state officers. And his release 2 weeks later coincided broadly in time with the death of Siqueiros that happened in January 1974, who had proclaimed him by that time his intellectual heir. Híjar then started working on the newly created Siqueiros Public Art Gallery, which is still ongoing activities, on the site of the former studio of the artist. I'm showing this. Well, this is a journal that it only consisted on 2 numbers that he published from the Siqueiros Public Art Gallery. And taking the SAPS for the initials SAPS as the new base for his activities, he transformed his live course on art into a more intense and politically committed group of artists, filmmakers, students, and intellectuals aimed at establishing a fruitful articulation of theoretical thinking and activist cultural practice, art practice. It was called the Art and Ideology Workshop, and this is the kind of emblem of the workshop that was designed by Attilio Tuis, that was one of the members and plastic artist. From 1975 onwards, TAI's activities focused on the study of Marxist philosophers of the Althusserian school. Cesario Morales, a Mexican philosopher, says Híjar is the first Althusserian in Mexico. And other important Marxist intellectuals such as Bertolt Brecht or Gramsci. But more prominently, activities at the Siqueiros Public Art Gallery made clear the urge to consolidate networks of solidarity and public actions in support of revolutionary struggles in the Third World. This is some seminars they conducted around Marx and Althusser, and I wanted to show this publication from 1978 that comprises some of their activities, and you can see posters of their activities at the time regarding Cuba or the Federal Republic of Germany or fascism, the question of fascism in America. In this way, they managed to organize a significant number of cultural actions, as you can see, that were encounters on the first anniversary of the Vietnam victory, exhibitions and roundtables in solidarity with Chile after the coup, screenings coinciding with the 10th anniversary of the Mexican student movement, activities promoting Cuba, or a series of weekly encounters on culture and politics organized by UNAM, which was a university workers' union by the time. And it's important to, if you take a look at these leaflets and these are advertising in newspapers, film, in all these activities, cinema played an important role, a really determined role, be it in the form of film screenings or panel discussions, workshops, or even as the main topic for at least one monographic symposium. You can see, for example, films from Grupo de la Base in Argentina, alongside with a little film that they did at the time, and other films here around the 10th anniversary of the Mexican student movement and so on. And this is, I don't know why this is stretched that way, it should be. But if you see, these are some of activities they did with Periódico Vivo, with the Students' Union, and there was a series of workshops and seminars, and maybe even every month or so, they were discussing questions of political cinema and third cinema. And so, this is a symposium on Cinema Day organized also. More. By 1976, Híjar and his friend Helen Escobedo, with whom he had already worked in different projects and exhibitions at UNAM, curated the Mexican representation at the 10th Paris Young Art Biennial. This is a poster and the catalog they did in Mexico that took place in 1977 with a radical and polemical proposal that focused on the promotion of a group of Mexican art collectives of the time, including TAI, including themselves. The Paris Biennial was the first event in which three of the founding collectives of the Future Front, TAI, Proceso Pentágono, and Grupo Suma, coincided for the first time. And shortly after this exhibition, in February 4 and 5 of 1978, coinciding with the anniversary of the Second Declaration of Havana in 1962, Híjar and TAI were involved in the creation of the Mexican Front of Cultural Workers Group, that was the first name of this association. A league of artistic collectives that also included other groups such as Germinal, El Taco de la Perra Brava, Grupo Mira, or the film collective Taller de Cine Octubre. This is a photo of one of the first meetings, and you can see Híjar here, the second on the right. The front came out on the need to organize the autonomy of the artistic and cultural work in Mexico in a more politically engaged way. That is, as an attempt to intervene in the socio-political arena of the time, both in Mexico and abroad. But especially for Híjar and the members of TAI, the front was the continuation by other means of a long-standing history of collective organizations of cultural workers in Mexico, as it was traversed not just by the national political situation, that is, the events of 1968 that were still very present, and the dirty war against guerrilla that followed, but also the struggles for liberation in Central America and the threat of fascism in other countries of the region. In their founding statement, this is a rough translation of the statement, signing members of the front stressed the need to exert an active solidarity to proletarian and democratic struggles in the Third World, and focused on the promotion of collective forms of cultural work. Even if the most ambitious and famous endeavor of the front was the organization of a collective exhibition, America en la Mira, in 1978. This is the poster for this exhibition. The situation in Nicaragua was present from its initial statement, as you can read in this slide. There's a reference to the movement of the masses, especially those of Nicaraguan people there. Support for the Nicaraguan process can also be seen in a 1979 exhibition organized by the front in the Centro Proceso Pentágono, which was the spatial center of the front. I'm referring to the poster at the left. This exhibition connected the 8th anniversary of the Alconazo in June 10, 1971, which was a student massacre that followed the massacre of Tlatelolco in 1968. And it was connected with the screening of Berta Navarro's Nicaragua, Los que harán la libertad, a film that she did in 1979 in Nicaragua, while they were still fighting. Nonetheless, the most significant activity of the front regarding Nicaragua was precisely the cultural project designed by IJAR for a revolutionary cultural politics that I will be talking right now. This project was meant to educate Nicaraguan cultural agents in the task of sensitizing broader audiences on revolutionary problematics, and took place with significant changes and adaptations between November 1978 and January 1980. As I will show, the original project designed by IJAR gave a prominent side to cinema. I'll just take the tour in order to reconstruct the intellectual path followed by IJAR from the late 1960s to 1979 in order to come to the Nicaraguan project. So IJAR and Third Cinema, anyway. From the late 1960s, IJAR's expeditions with his live course on art allowed him to attend to the screenings, maybe one of the first people in Mexico in attending these kind of screenings, of some of the most important films of the new Latin American cinema, such as Jaguar Malcu, screened in Ecuador in 1969. He makes reference to this screening as a game-changing for him, or La Hora de los Hornos, The Hour of the Furnaces, in Cuba in 1970. Also, it gave him direct and immediate access to the cultural production related to cinema in Latin America, in journals such as Cine Cubano, Cine del Tercer Mundo, or Hablemos de Cine. In 1968, he was one of the conductors of Cine Debate Popular, which was a kind of university film club co-organized by two of the most important and unknown figures of the Mexican militant cinema of the time, Carlos de Hoyos and Carlos Mendez, who would eventually publish the first political journal of film in Mexico in October 1970, Cine Club. Alejandro showed us this same slide, in fact. Before they took part in the first militant film collective in Mexico, the Marginal Film Cooperative, which is something that I'm also working in my research project. IJAR's interest in Third Cinema led him to publish in 1972 what is, as far as I know, one of the first, if not the first, edited book on the problems of Third Cinema to have been published in Latin America. It's Hacia un Tercer Cine, this volume, published by UNAM in 1972. In it, IJAR compiled texts published in the aforementioned journals, in Cine Cubano, Hablemos de Cine, and so on, and wrote a long introductory essay on the problems of Third Cinema. This publication was preceded by two unpublished documents that I'll just show in passing, one from 1970, co-written with Elena Escobedo for a kind of symposium at UNAM, is the one of the at the right, another from 1971 that was expected to be published in this journal in the number 3 that never happened because this journal had only 2 numbers. As the first document that I've commented suggests, cinema was for IJAR the main, I don't know if you can read, well, you can't, but I'll read it for you. Cinema was the exemplary experience of a critical culture for Latin America. This is precisely what it's highlighted there. over other significant artistic practices that he's mentioning, such as Julio Lepard's cultural guerrilla. He's mentioning in parallel those two movements in a way. Where am I? I've lost myself. Sorry. Okay. For Ijar, then, Third Cinema was a fully artistic event in the sense that was, to quote Solana Sangetino at the end of their manifest towards the Third Cinema, that could help think in a broader sense a significant set of questions related to the arts as a whole, and that were part of his own preoccupations, such as the complex temporality of an emancipatory cultural practice aimed also at sustaining a history and a memory of social struggles, but also the blurring of the distinctions between makers and spectators or audiences, and the distinctions between theory and practice, and the quest for collective creation and self-representation, and the need for mobilizing cultural artifacts, mobilizing both in a political and a cinematic dimension, that is, as the need for circulating, reproducing, sharing, discussing, etc., through networks of communication, solidarity, and exchange. Also, Third Cinema helped Ijar take a solid stance against what he considered as spontaneisms or leftisms, and cathartic investments in ephemeral art practices, such as happenings and performance, who he was really very cautious. Contrary to the temporality associated with the ephemerality of the intervention as act, that also encompassed the idea of cinema as guerrilla, Ijar endorsed a less exciting practice that placed the production of the conditions of reproduction into the foreground. He pushed for, and I'm quoting, a practice of constant feed and feedback between producers, exhibitors, and militants, and the specific masses in a planned and constant action, and unquote. This planned and constant action meant that the criticality and efficacy of its praxis, I am quoting again, resides not in the work in itself, but in its debate, including in a totalizing revolutionary strategy. In sum, Ijar called for the, and I'm quoting again, clandestine, grey, and long-term struggle in the cultural field that followed José Revuelta's concept of revolution as a task of a whole life. Ijar's ideas on Third Cinema were further developed in the form of a reflection on the work of Jorge Sanginés and his Ucamau group, in a text he published in the film journal Octubre from 1979, just months before the Nicaraguan project was designed. And it was edited by another film collective that came from UNAM, from the Center of Film Studies at UNAM. Ijar's text focused in the day after revolution, in a way. Ucamau cinema exemplified a cultural practice concerned with the national question, that is, with ruralism, indigenism, and local epistemologies, and with the formal articulation of non-Western modes of representation. And with the construction of a non-bourgeois and politicized humanism, he was very concerned with how to engage with humanism coming from the Anatu-Syrian anti-humanist school. That in Ucamau's case, it drew from pre-Columbine survivals that could help developing the Americanization of Marxism, which was one of its war horses in that time. As I will show, Ijar's reading of the cultural work of Ucamau was picked up and expanded in his seminar for Nicaragua, where he stressed the need for reconstructing a whole new circuit of cultural production that could help shape the aesthetic dimension of an emancipatory politics. So I'm just moving faster to the cultural project for Nicaragua, and it's important to note that the connection that led to this project were not made by the front, but by two members of the Forces of National Liberation that were really close to Ijar, and even though the clandestine character of the FLN have until recently discouraged any public mention to the crucial role in this project. But Ijar's position has recently changed, and we now know that the project started to take shape with the meeting of Lenin Cerdá, which was an official of the Nicaraguan FSLN, who by the mid-70s was established in Cuernavaca, consolidating networks of political activism between Mexico and Nicaragua, with two members of the FLN, which were mates of Ijar, Dolores de las Peñas and Enrique Echeverría, who are mentioned in the project. Both militants traveled to Nicaragua by the mid-1979, And she got in touch with Ernesto Cardenal, Secretary of Culture in the new government of Nicaragua, and he commissioned to design to IJAR and carry out this cultural project. So the project presented by IJAR for Revolutionary Cultural Politics, this is the whole project, dated October 2nd, 1979, was comprised of a seminar, a brief course, and on avant-garde artistic production in America, and a workshop in signifying practices. To give a sense of its dimension, IJAR's idea was to give 30 sessions for each of the first 2 parts, while conducting the workshop simultaneously, so a total amount of 60 sessions plus the workshop. So it was really a big thing. But a second document, dated some days later, in October 11th, 1979, consisted exclusively on a seminar in which the former 3 parts were condensed. As you can read in the slides, I think, in one of these slides, it's in Spanish. Sorry, I haven't translated, but I'm going to talk about this. The more theoretically informed parts of the project were consistent with IJAR's activities as coordinator of the live course on art and Thai. It means there were works on text by Lunacharsky, Lenin, Brecht, Martha Harnecker, IJAR himself, Althusser, Fanon, or Che Guevara. And moving from these theoretical discussions, the last section aimed at presenting practices of ideological struggle in 3 different avant-garde movements. And he mentioned first third cinema, then agit theater, and then the visual arts. Again, so the discussion on third cinema appears in the first place as an introduction for his insights on Bowles' theater of the oppressed, and the closing section that was an overview of their own activities as a group, as an art group with the front. And it's worth noting that the first draft, the second draft was a displacement and a condensation of the original idea of the course, where IJAR had in mind the discussion of the long history of public art in Mexico. So he condensed it, and then he decided that he was going to talk about themselves in a way, and not about the history of the Mexican school of painting. This prominent position of cinema is consistent with the first draft, where a series of workshops cycling around the idea of film and audiovisual media played a prominent role. The proposal for that workshop consisted on 3 different exercises. The first was the elaboration of historical screenplays for audiovisual production with the slides and the staging of testimonial, documentary, or agitprop materials. The second, this is those exercises that I'm reading in the below part of this document. The second designed the design of strategies of circulation of audiovisual materials and staged projects like theater projects. And the third and final, the elaboration of networks of circulation of artistic and scientific materials, as well as the discussion on how to expand and reproduce these networks and cultural brigades. And it is important to note that these exercises reproduced IJAR's idea on taking control over the whole process of production, even if it could meant the dismissal of a proper cinematic practice. And also that they strengthened the importance given to history and to testimonio, in line with Alejandro's presentation, a preoccupation already present in IJAR's reflection on the work of Grupo Camao. However, the original idea of the seminar was far from becoming reality. The actual seminar was not called for a revolutionary cultural politics, but First Seminar for Cultural Agents, Leonel Rugama, a shift that signaled the displacement of IJAR's interests from his more cold and theoretically inflected previous rhetorics to history, martyrdom, and commemoration. In fact, Leonel Rugama was one of the martyrs of the Sandinista revolution, was a poet and militant who shot to death in 1970 at the age of 21, I remember, by Somoza's National Guard. So, to conclude, these are some, yeah, I'm concluding.
Just wanted to use
thank you. This is one of the few photographs of their experience in Nicaragua. And well, just days after his comeback to Mexico in January 1980, IJAR published an article in the cultural supplement El Gallo Ilustrado called Nicaragua, Nicaragua, la cultura, la revolución, Nicaragua Culture and Revolution. In it, he stated that more than teaching, he had learned with his participation in the seminars. And what he learned was, in the first place, that all his ideas on lecturing on Soviet aesthetics or the fundamentals of an ideological critique paled in the face of material, economic, and educational reality of Nicaragua. In different newspapers articles published between January and March 1980, on his expedition, he really, he was publishing all the time about the work in Nicaragua. He made clear not just that there was no room for cinema, but that there was even no room for more humble visual techniques, such as mural painting, for example. I'm quoting from one of these articles. There is nothing for murals in a country that is eating its last harvests and its last cattle. It could be thus said that Nicaragua taught him the true meaning of the rhetorics of a materialist approach to a popular cultural practice, that forms, and I'm quoting again, could only be resolved in practice in the transformation of the determinants of signification in the concrete situation, unquote. In Nicaragua, this meant light methods of graphic production, music, dance, public debates, and so on. A final turn into ephemerality that implied also an amendment to Siqueiros' disdain for poor technical quality artworks. Of course, this was no more than the recognition of the true lesson offered years before by Cuban director Julio García Espinosa, whose call for an imperfect cinema was never an allegation in favor of turning scarcity into a signifier for our revolutionary politics, but on the contrary, a call for the need to internalize in the very formal order of the cultural work the incompleteness that is the state of permanent becoming of the social order. In this sense, Ihar did not turn his back in Ucamau cinema nor in the theory and practice of third cinema in a general sense. On the contrary, he was pushing it to its own logical and practical limits. Limits that, needless to say, dissolved cinema into a kind of social practice. And, well, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you. I wanted to ask you, Miguel, if you can see some links between the Marxism developed by Sanchez Vasquez and the work of Ihar.
Okay, may I go on?
Sure. Sorry. Well, maybe we can
maybe
gather some more questions.
I don't know how.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay. So let me write this.
Well, mine is just a comment that actually it is me who stole that slide from him, not the other way around. Huh? That it is me that stole the slide from you and not the other way around.
I know,
and
but
that
you presented first. So.
And that actually that note about because it's a quite important finding, I think, the thing about that the text that appeared in Tricontinental, towards third cinema, it's not actually the text that has been mostly translated, but the text that appeared first in Cineclub and then in Ihar. And that is something that I haven't found anywhere. I've found out because of you. So it is. I think it's not. It hasn't. There's several texts about the history of the text and the development. Also in the English translations, there are a couple of articles about that, but there's no reference to the fact that actually they translated it from Ihar's publication that took from Cineclub and not from the text that appeared in Tricontinental. So.
Since your papers seem to interconnect, I can come back to the question of realism and avant-garde and this notion of the disfiguring, because I think that's a key component in what Alejandro ended with, is the revolution happened and you have it institutionalized in Mexico. So then what happens next? And that comes back to Reynal, because he comes to Mexico hoping for the utopian fulfillment of a revolution, which doesn't happen. And the reason why he wants to leave Mexico. So the disfiguring comes in because if you have a revolutionary language, i.e. muralism in Mexico, that has become codified, how do you move beyond that revolutionary language and reach then to a new avant-garde? And I'm riffing off of my Eastern Europe and Central European references, particularly Lachner, because I think there's a parallel there. For him, is fighting between the old left, which would be the PRI in Mexico, and the new left, which is where Ijar and your Walsh is. So that to re-engage with an everyday, to understand what are the new figures, the new real figures in the landscape that one has to make present and real in the artwork to really articulate this existential experience, this phenomenal experience in the world that the old left language has disengaged with or has no longer any relationship with. So I don't know if that helps in furthering our discussion throughout this whole symposium, is how do we reach to a new realism or a new revolutionary avant-garde that really addresses this new existential experience in the aftermath of an institutionalized revolution.
Thank you, Miguel. It was completely fascinating for me, really.
Thank you.
And I of course, we talk a little bit, but I'm very interested in how suddenly Le Parc guerrilla concept appears in Ijar's text. And I wonder, I was doing this mapping of how guerrilla is actually ubiquitous in 1960s, from 1967 all around the world. A lot of critics and artists are taking this term and reusing it in different contexts, but I didn't know about the case of Ijar, and I really like, because he's a person that exemplifies how interconnected everything was, how he was thinking in terms of cinema, of theater, on also visual arts, and the Grupo Mira and things like that. So I mean, it's fascinating. And so I wonder, if you could expand a little bit more first, is he actually directly using the guerrillas, the past guerrillas, actually identifying it like that? I was wondering if he was actually at the Congreso Cultural de La Habana.
That's my guess.
Yeah, but I mean, Le Parc wasn't there. But you know who actually in the stand talk about the idea of a guerrilla was Roberto Mata. He said that in the Congress. So I was wondering how they got connected to each other. Yes, and also in the case of Le Parc, guerrilla implied the awakening of the spectator taking command of the situation and transforming the reality. No, and so I wonder what are the difference? Or it's super interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think we've gathered enough questions.
Yeah, there's a lot of things to talk about. Well, I can start for the last one, your question, and then go back to the first one. The thing is that he's using, he goes on and on to the same topics in a huge range of texts, because he's not a very systematic thinker, but he published in a lot of journals and newspapers and pamphlets and so on. So the first reference to Le Parc's cultural guerrilla, I found it in that manuscript, type manuscript that I found in Arqueia at the MOAC. No, it's in Fenidiap. It's in the archives that are stored by Cristina Ijar, by his. ¿Qué me pasa? Hija. Bueno, sorry. So he makes a reference to Le Parc's cultural guerrilla, and in this first reference, he is using it in parallel with towards a third cinema, with Solana Sangetino's text on third cinema. This text was written roughly in October 1970, and he had came back from Cuba because he was there in the summer. So my guess is that he found everything there, and in fact it connects with the thing that Alejandro was commenting. This text, Solana Sangetino's text, towards the third cinema, was first published in 1969 in Tricontinental, but even if there were different versions of the text in different languages, the English translation of the text sprung from this tricontinental version. But the most widespread version of the text in Spanish was not the version that was published in tricontinental. There was significant changes, and that has been examined by different scholars, such as Jonathan Rosbaum, I think is, I don't remember the name. Yeah. Anyway, this text appeared in this little journal made in Mexico, Cine Club, that was nothing at the time, was not connected to nothing. So it's really strange that the final version of the text that was republished in 1973 in UNAM was in UNAM, no, in siglo XXI, I think, sprung for that version. So my guess is that Hija came from Cuba with all these documents, but I have asked him, and he doesn't remember nothing. So it's very. Yeah, that's why I'm saying that he came back to Cuba from Cuba with the documents regarding Le Par's cultural guerrilla and Solanas Argentino towards the third cinema, both the text and the movie, which I know he saw in Cuba at that time. Because towards the third, the Hour of the Furnaces was not exhibited in Mexico until 1971, until late 1971. So he was the first one in seeing this and watching this movie. So yeah, he was taking those movements in the arts, taken in an expanded sense, in parallel. But but lately he took distance from Le Parc's cultural guerrilla, because he saw that it could be understood at some kind of countercultural and more petit bourgeois kind of interventions in the art field. That he was thinking of the art scene of Mexico at the time, and he was really in conflict with other kind of art positions, and this connects with the thing of a revolution and the Mexican School of Painting as a revolution of formal language, and how to go beyond that, because in Mexico, from the Generación de la Ruptura, muralism was absolutely debased for completely. And after 1968, of course, there's another a different sense of how to deal with the art in regards of realism, but also in regards of its public investment, his public engagement and political engagement. But the Mexican School of Painting and Muralism has never been at the center of that re-evaluation of art and political commitment.
Whereas in the Eastern European perspective would be socialist realism.
No, it's different. It's very different. It's much more. Well, she will talks about Siqueiros this afternoon, and the kind of experimentalism and the kind of connections that they drew with other parts of the avant-garde movements, also in the United States, were really, really vast. It was another kind of thing. But Hija is one of the main figures.
What is this realism that?
The Mexican School of Painting springs from the revolution in Mexico. So,
I guess what you're saying to me is that muralism is still considered as a valid realism within the discourse.
No, the thing is that from the 50s, muralism was just taken apart completely from the debates.
So that's parallel with socialist realism in that sense. Because socialist realism at that point is beginning to be taken apart. Once Stalin dies, you see
in a way, the reaction to muralism is, it's in parallel.
That's the parallel.
That's a parallel, yes. And it's, well, Irene is going to talk us about that later, but it's amazing in a way that this tradition of the Mexican School of Painting has never been retaken in a way, even if the groups drew on that genealogies a lot. And Hija is the intellectual heir of Siqueiros, but Siqueiros is still a kind of strange figure in Mexico that no one wants to deal with, in a way, So it's important, and I think that is the reason why IJAR has not been reevaluated as much as I think he would have to be reevaluated. And other figures such of the time, such as Juan Hacha, for example, have played a more important role in the new histories of that epoch in Mexico, while Hacha was not as important as IJAR in terms of actions and in terms of their commitment with the groups of the time. For example, IJAR tried to merge those groups in a kind of collective, and all they did was get drunk, and nothing stood out of that. And IJAR made the front, and they worked for 5-6 years, and they did a lot of things, and it's this kind of thing that also talks about his kind of disdain in a way to this kind of new forms of art regarding happenings and interventions and all that stuff. And this is the reason why Alberto IJAR and Felipe Ehrenberg, Proceso Pentágonos, were really close friends, but they were, in terms of aesthetic thinking, they were really like kind of counterparts. And regarding Sanchez Vázquez, this is for IJAR. Sanchez Vázquez had a more philosophical approach to aesthetics, and he wasn't committed, and he wasn't, he didn't go to the ground. And IJAR was really interested in, taking the pulse of the social life of the people.
Let's have a break, and then 15 minutes, okay.
Thank you.